Today's interview is with Dr. Edna Bonhomme. She has written a book called A History of the World in Six Plagues. It's a groundbreaking work that explores the hidden connections between global disease and systemic divides on race and class. Through memoir and reportage, she also shows how humans can come to manage their health when they feel confined by larger forces. By tracing 6 disease crises throughout history, cholera, HIV/AIDS, the Spanish flu, sleeping sickness, Ebola, and COVID-19, she exposes the challenges of race and class-based decision-making that have time and time again worsened outbreaks and harmed marginalized communities. Her book shows the complexities of illness, who we are, and how we garner resilience in the face of mass suffering. And I do believe you're going to really enjoy this conversation. A little bit about Dr. Edna Bonhomme. She's a historian of science, culture writer, and book critic. She has a Ph.D. from Princeton University and a master's degree from Columbia University and a bachelor's degree from Reed College. She previously held fellowships at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, the Camargo Foundation, Baldwin for the Arts, and Nancy B. Negligee's Artist Residency Program, and much more. She has been awarded the Robert Silvers Foundation Grant for Works in Progress and the Andy Warhol Foundation Writing Grant. She contributes frequently for Frieze Magazine, and her work has appeared in Al Jazeera, The Atlantic, Esquire, The Guardian, Nation, The Nation, London Review of Books, The Washington Post, and more. And she has much more writings. She lives in Berlin, Germany currently, and I will be posting all of her socials and where to buy the book in the show notes. All right, let's get to the interview. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Edna Bonhomme. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to this conversation.
It's my pleasure. And I've been reading your book, the new book that just came out in March of 2025, A History of the World in Six Plagues, subtitle, How Contagion, Class, and Captivity Shaped Us from Cholera to COVID-19. And I must give you a compliment. The first thing that came into my mind was a more readable version of the people's history of the United States. Not that it wasn't readable, but that book was very difficult for me to get through. And this book, I was just whipping through it because it kind of is a sociological take with a lot of history and just the right amount of commentary, where I felt like you let the reader sort of understand things and then connect it to their lives. So I really think it's a great book, considering the content is a little scary. So thank you for writing it.
Well, I definitely appreciate your compliment, and also gesturing towards my book resonating with Howard Zinn's seminal text, A History of the People's History of the United States. As a leftist and also as a historian, it warms my heart.
Yes, it was very, very excellent so far, and I'm looking forward to reading the rest of it eventually, but so far I was just very impressed. So I think this is going to be a book people get into. So, I know some of why you wrote the book because I've read the beginning and your personal, but you, growing up, you had experience with typhoid. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So one of the first things I would say is that I'm very much inspired by various critical theorists, writers such as Joan Didion, as well as science journalist Linda Villarosa, and the works of Ed Yong, and so forth. And the reason I bring them up is because so often the best types of essay writing and science journalism has and gestures towards some personal element so that they can draw the reader into the stakes of a particular history or the stakes of a political question. And so, like many people during the early period of the COVID-19 lockdown, I was a bit rattled unsettled by the confinement that I was experiencing, and I wanted to get a sense of why that was the case. And I'm sure that many of your audience members would be excited to hear that I really wanted to engage with psychoanalysis in a sense, with childhood memories and the ways in which the subconscious helps to influence why someone might behave a particular way or might feel upset by a current event. And so part of what I did is to really just examine past memories and to get a sense of how the COVID pandemic in March of 2020 was impacting me. And so, as you referenced, I specifically write about my experience of being young in the late 80s as a child and having typhoid fever and being hospitalized. Similar to the early stages of the COVID lockdown, there was a bit of uncertainty. There's the sense that I didn't have autonomy over where I could go and so forth. But I think what the difference, though, and specifically in the childlike state, is that so many of the decisions and sense of freedom were made by my parents. And within the context of COVID, I had a better understanding of the biology of the disease. I could go outside. I could do some basic activities. And part of the reason that this personal account was important to me was to really get a sense of the anxiety and fear that many people might have been experiencing, and to try to get a sense of how this was replicated at different points in history, particularly in the 1800s with cholera, to even in the 1980s with the HIV/AIDS epidemic in New York City.
Yeah, that is excellent. So you took that personal experience, and then during the lockdown, did you write this book during the lockdown, more or less?
So part of it was written during the lockdown,
Okay.
and there are times in which I was able to basically write op-eds that I was writing about, for example, the relationship between structural racism and the COVID cases and deaths, looking at the relationship between anti-vaccination movements in Germany and the rise of the far right, which I wrote an article in The Atlantic about this as well. But I also looked at and wanted to truly understand how literature, and more specifically authors, were inspired by pandemics in the past time. So thinking about how pandemic novels really had a popularity within the context of 1918, 1919, after the Spanish flu, or what people call the Spanish flu. But and so part of the book, yes, was written in the initial stages of the lockdown. But I would say that it was very much inspired by a host of sources: the literature I was reading, the poetry I was reading, the walks I was taking out in nature, conversations I was having with friends, as well as reading the peer-reviewed scientific articles that help to inform how diseases have been changing over the time.
Okay, so it's just an amalgamation of things that sort of led to this book, because you were already writing op-eds and more concentrated pieces. And this book, you traverse many different topics, but they're all plagues, basically. they're all just different sociological and historical takes that are longer probably than a regular article. Like, for instance, the chapter 1, which I very much was intrigued by, the Contagion on the Plantation chapter, about cholera during American slavery in the 1800s, was just so intriguing to me, because I have read about slavery and advanced classes and about the political climate at the time, but I had not actually read about how the plantation owners would. Some of them were doctors, which is really horrific. The one guy, oh my God! But there was, that they would hire doctors to treat the people they were enslaving on the plantation, but then the way that they would write about them as like subhuman
I don't know what they call them, subhuman species, but then they all had names. They had like regular names, and they were like, oh, well, they're going to have kids and we got to do this with the kids. So it's like this bizarre cognitive dissonance that I was reading in this chapter, where on one hand, they were dehumanizing the enslaved people. And then on the other hand, they knew they were human. So like there was this way like, oh, we're going to, because of our religion or whatever and our propriety, we can't say we're enslaving regular people. We have to say they're subhuman, but then we know they're human because we're bringing in these doctors to help treat cholera, which they were all basically experimental treatments that didn't really have any bearing. Can you talk a little bit about that chapter? I mean, I think there's so much to say about it, but I feel like it was enlightening to me to just, you had quotes from the actual people that were, the slave owners, basically.
Yeah, so one of the beauties and the curse of engaging with historical texts is that one sees the atrocities and that other humans could do to individuals. And as you precisely say, and as I write about, that the justification of something like chattel slavery didn't happen by accident or for people who were ignorant somehow, but rather through intentional and very detailed processes. So as someone who has a Ph.D. in history of science, and as someone who also studied biology in undergrad, my work tries to look at the contradictions between science, which I value science as a discipline, as something that has been evolving for over 2,000 years, and something that we benefit from, and whether it's microbiology or even understanding the theory of special relativity. At the same time, people who were classified as scientists can use that language in the past to justify horrific institutions and such as enslavement. And one particular person that I start the book off with is Samuel Cartwright, who is a white American scholar, scientist, who specifically wrote extensively about the alleged inferiority of Black people in the United States. And he wrote several books to justify this erroneous claim. And part of the reason that I wrote about him is not just to point out him as an exception, but to show how he was part of a group of learned men who perpetuated racist ideas, or what some people refer to as scientific racism, or now in retrospect, pseudoscience. But he wasn't alone. There are people who were writing similar texts in Europe and North America, such as Carl Linnaeus, J. Marion Sims, and so forth. But part of what I wanted to excavate or to have people think deeply about is how the condition and the kind of architecture of enslavement, being on a plantation, not having the freedom of movement, not having autonomy over your time, created the conditions that made enslaved people sick. And I also wanted to point out, and this is maybe a story that perhaps most people aren't always aware, is that during the initial period of emancipation during construction, there was a lot of hope and opening to provide formerly enslaved people with access to free healthcare. And I talk about that period as a space and the potential that could have been if that free healthcare had become truly universal. And can you imagine if the United States had universal healthcare in the 1860s and 70s, in the same way that many of the newly freed African Americans during the period of Reconstruction demanded free education, and we have universal education in the US for now. If that had happened with medicine, it would have really pushed this country forward in ensuring that everyone had a right to their better health and their dignity.
Yeah, that's very well put. I was thinking about that chapter in many ways. The first way, I guess there's a little through line, and then I'm going to ask a question about one of the particular stories, but the through line I'm seeing that really struck me as a person in psychology and who's been in psychology for over 18 years was the rationalization, the justification through science, but now we know is pseudoscience. It was basically just like theories that were touted as fact, to justify not only the enslavement of the people, but like the way that they treated them. And of course, everyone who is, not everyone, but the people you named that were often writing these texts or connected to writing these texts were financially benefiting from the labor. And in fact, most of the entire South was their whole economic, revolution of being able to do agriculture and all these things was dependent on free labor, essentially. And just even to the point where they were taking out insurance policies on enslaved people. And then, essentially, I was about to get into this next part, which is even worse. Harriet's story, but
Harriet Jacobs.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that in a second. But I do think that it's really important for folks listeners to understand that while some of this was in the law and political, those laws came from cultural understanding. And I do think that the war of information and the way that it was presented in an entire region created these policies, right? And so, whereas in the most parts of the North of the U.S., there was not as much active in slavery, as far as I understand, towards the Civil War period. Am I right on that? Or?
Well, one thing one has to acknowledge and recognize during the 19th century and before, especially with chattel slavery, is that even if in circumstances in which a region was not directly involved in enslavement, they might have profited from it. That is to say, in the North, in many states, there weren't plantations in the way that the South had, nor was slavery as brutal. But at the same time, they used the cotton to create textiles and had indentured servitude and all kinds of things. And it wasn't just the United States. There was slavery in Brazil, in Cuba. In fact, Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery of African descended people. And also Europeans profited heavily from enslavement in Manchester, in Nantes, in France, and so forth. Many of the materials and goods being produced in the Caribbean, Central America, South America, and the United States were shipped to Europe. And so slavery was an international, sadly, an international industry in which so many Western Europeans and North American white people benefited from. But nevertheless, one of the things that I also wanted to point out, which I think is significant to note, is that so long as there's been slavery or any institution that has been oppressive, there have been people who resisted it. There were people, African Americans, who escaped when they could, and I write the story about that, and I point out the various people, such as Harriet Jacobs, Frederick Douglass, who were manumitted in some cases on their own, in other cases with a network of people, and they also wrote about it. And so after they were free. So I think it's important to also note that people are able to resist. They can have autonomy even if they've spent years being made captive.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I want to make sure that we just mention at least Harriet Jacobs, who was able to sort of escape and hide in her grandmother's attic, I guess, and couldn't even come out, otherwise she'd be taken back. And the owner of the plantation, I can't remember his name was, but he literally, Dr. Norcom, I think it was. Yeah,
exactly.
He was a doctor. Oh yeah, Dr. James Norcom, who wrote a lot about his I guess work on the plantation, or I guess whatever you want to call that, like his plantation and his treatment of cholera and other things, he basically kind of had it out for Harriet, and she had to get out. It was like a person, like I'm sure this is not an isolated incident, but she was able to write about it eloquently, that she was like targeted and sort of, she was like a child, basically being like sexually advanced upon and all of these things. And then she eventually did get out and wrote the book she wrote, which I don't know, when did that come out after? When did that come out? I'm trying to remember. But anyway, it's an intriguing story because you're like a story of, resistance and, doing the right thing and telling the truth. And I was trying to point out psychologically that it was almost like both sides were trying to say they were doing the right, like the owners were trying to say we're doing the right thing to keep their economic, like you said, like it was like a huge economic boon to them to have free labor, right? But then in the midst of all this, being forced to work on all this, cholera. So can you tell us just a little bit about how that plague interacted with people that were in chattel slavery, people that were enslaved in the South?
Yeah, so during the 1800s, cholera was the pandemic that wrecked the lives of millions of people, from London to Shanghai to Buenos Aires. And it's a disease in which there are various outbreaks that occurred in like the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. What we see and what we know based off of historical records, whether it's trade manuals, newspaper clippings, and even government records, is that it was quite an urban disease. So when you have a high concentration of people living in a city where there isn't a robust sewage system, cholera can flow. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight is that it wasn't just in the cities that cholera was present or could cause damage onto people's lives, but it could also be found on a plantation, a space in which people were crowded and put into unsanitary situations. And so I did the work of looking at, going into the archives, looking at the autobiographies of formerly enslaved people such as Harriet Jacobs and Frederick Douglass, as well as looking at some plantation manuals and so forth, to get a sense of how this outbreak impacted people who lived on a plantation. One of the things that any historian who wants to understand the voices and perspective of marginalized people has to reckon with is that not every marginalized person writes a book or has the chance and the opportunity to have their voices heard. So one really has to be patient and diligent to really read against the grain and find as many sources as possible to get a fuller picture of that history. And that's precisely what I did, was to try to get perspectives from those who were the enslavers, financial records, as well as records from formerly enslaved people, to get a sense of not just how people were coping with cholera, but how disease as a whole was managed on a plantation.
Yes, and you did just that. And I think the part that was appealing to me was that you must have done a lot of editing here, because it flows really well. And I think as a reader, I was able to just go right through the chapter, and it was a historical analysis and narrative. And I think that's important for people who are interested in this topic, or topics, I should say, because it's about plagues and how that interacts with systems and how it can affect different populations differently. So I want to make sure to connect, before I ask about other things from the past, connecting a through line to our current situation, which seems to be changing daily, in 2025, and just the cultural makeup. And this is maybe not the easiest question to answer, because it's not really a single answer question. It's just more of an open-ended question. It's just about, how do you see what you've learned from these plagues and studying these different historical incidents how do you see things playing out now in the US and maybe the world when it comes to prevention and interception and treatment of mass pandemics? Kind of what's your kind of take currently? I mean, it could change as we know.
Yeah, so this is a big question, mostly because, the world can feel a bit polarized at the moment when it comes to how people understand epidemics, medicine, even vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
And we especially see this in the context of the United States, where peer-reviewed scientific research and even something as beneficial as vaccines is being called into question. And I think that it's no accident that when there is vaccine skepticism, there's also people who often mistrust the government, authority, and so forth. And I think that then the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, or also it's still amongst us, I don't want to discount those who have long COVID and so forth, that there's hasn't really been a sustained way to, on the one hand, address the concerns of people who might have that doubt, but on the other hand, figure out ways of building trust in science on a societal level. I think the big question is how do we build a situation in which people are able to understand that sometimes we need a collective response to a global problem such as a pandemic, or even what does it mean to think about how certain medical procedures that we have been able to inherit over the past several decades and also centuries, such as vaccination, is precisely what has allowed people to live longer and healthier lives. And so what does it mean to return back to a time where people didn't have access to polio vaccines or measles vaccines? I personally see that as a scary thing, at least in the context of the moment we're living in now. I think that more than anything, especially within the United States, there has to be a very serious conversation on what it would mean to have Medicare for all, so that at least on a very basic level, people have access to healthcare, a primary physician that they can talk to answer very basic questions about what's happening to their bodies and their health, as opposed to the millions of people who don't have access to healthcare, and therefore medicine can feel like a mysterious field or discipline. And so I think at a bare minimum, we need universal healthcare in the US as well as globally, because diseases and outbreaks don't see health insurance. Like, they don't stop at a person just because they have healthcare or health insurance. It's something that can move from person to person and cause havoc. And until we deal with ensuring that everyone has access and a right to healthcare globally, it might be quite difficult to address some of the polarization that exists in our society.
Yeah, I could definitely understand the need for some type of universal care that would at least give you basic things. Like, that's what I've always said, is like, I think people are afraid of like universal healthcare because it would cost so much or whatever. And I say, okay, what about just basic stuff like emergency room, vaccination, preventative checkups, like at least having some basic baseline, or actually having full coverage would be amazing. I know the US can actually afford it. That's a whole nother topic. I'm not a political analyst, but if you just look at our budget, we can afford it. But we aren't doing it. So what that brings us to is, like, I almost wonder about this. Like you said, it's almost like going back in time, because it would be a very uneven response to the next plague or endemic or pandemic that comes along, meaning that people that have access might fare better, and people that don't have access or education are going to be facing the worst consequences. And sociologically, I think most people know the answer where I'm going. Who suffers when you don't have that is more usually people with lower socioeconomic status, marginalized folks don't have that access. And so I think most people would argue that if we're going to be a society together, we should be preventing this together, right? And or treating it together, so that, I mean, just on a base level, humanity, right? Like, we should be treating each other, we all live here, equally and fairly. But let's just pretend let's just say that isn't the main point of a government official. I think as a country, if you're a government official, even if you have some sort of ideology that we should all be independent, individualized people taking care of ourselves, and we have to figure it out ourselves, like, that's the responsibility, that's your ideology. If you have that ideology, that's not how plagues and pandemics spread. They don't spread based on, oh, well, these folks know how to treat this, so they'll be okay. It's going to affect us all. So I think in the long run, even on an economic level, if we don't have some type of options for people, or the government taking responsibility for preventing these plagues or treating them if they come, then we're going to have mass chaos. And eventually, what most government officials care about, economics, are going to dip big time. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that one thing that has been an inspiration to me is the plethora of medical writing or history of science writing out there. So Anne Boyer's The Undying, which is a memoir about her cancer experience, or The Empire of Malady by Siddhartha Mukherjee, which considers and documents how illness shapes how one sees one's family and society. And I bring up these two texts when obviously there's a lot more that I could discuss, because they actually show and highlight that at some point in our lives, we all get sick. And we do, and it isn't the case necessarily that always that means that we will die, or that or that it's a chronic illness necessarily. However, based off of the structural environment we live in, if we have access to clinics, doctors, psychological support, if we have family members who can care for us, if we feel safe, if we're well fed, that can ultimately determine how well we can cope with an illness. And part of what I'm trying to do in this book is to highlight, the states of exception of an epidemic. Mass death is happening, mass infection. And, what helps in many of these cases is when patients are listened to, when people are humane towards each other during these crises, and also when there's evidence-based approaches to tackling a disease as opposed to stoking fear. In fact, one of the chapters that I wrote in the book looks at HIV/AIDS and how it impacted people in a prison, a women's prison in particular. And one would imagine that it's a horrific chapter insofar that prison is a space in which there's forced confinement, you don't have control over your time or freedom of movement and so forth. And I don't just tell the story of suffering and trauma, but I tell the story of these women who formed a collective caring community by having a peer counseling program, by creating arts programs to provide care for people who are HIV positive. And they even did the work of rigorous intellectual and public health research as well, to the point that some of them wrote peer-reviewed public health articles. And in one case, they also came together to write a book about what HIV/AIDS looks like in the prison. And I think this matters because we do have the capacity, especially when we are able to come together vis-a-vis these collective processes, to make the lives of individuals better. But it can't happen, through without the funding structure. It can happen by virtue of siphoning oneself and being individualistic in the ways in which U.S. society can often feel.
Yes, and I would even say, and this you didn't write, you were writing specifically about some of those stories in there, but in the overall, in the AIDS crisis in the early 80s, I had, people, mentors that lived through it that are in the gay community, and they were a couple monogamous, and they had gotten together right before AIDS hit. And so they didn't get any sort of infection through dating or any sexual activity because they were together, but they had like 7 to 10 friends die. And not only that, in Chicago at that time, there's a book, and now I'm going to lose the name, but there's a book about a doctor in the 1980s who still practices in the north side of Chicago, who was the only doctor at the time. He was in his 20s, he may be 28, I think, who was actually openly treating HIV/AIDS patients at the beginning of the epidemic, I guess. I'm not sure how to say it. Plague, essentially. And during that time, that was not long ago. That was the 80s. The president at the time, Reagan, and other officials all over the government who had authority to say things, instead of trying to tackle this health crisis, they looked for scapegoats to blame it on all sorts of people, other countries. Being gay was the problem, like all of these sort of different things. And so, in fact, a lot of the research and treatment was delayed multiple years until what you're probably going to see what came next is collectives of people came together and said, we need to work on this. We cannot just say, live in fear of this and blame people. And of course, the famous story of, I think it was Ryan White, which kind of brought it into the mainstream U.S. consciousness, was that he was a blood transfusion patient. So they couldn't blame him for his his whatever affiliations. And that kind of opened up some of the suburban middle class people's minds to the fact that we should work on this, and more doctors. But it was crazy because there was doctors, do no harm, right? The Hippocratic Oath, that were discriminating against people. And this was not very long ago. And this was in major US cities in research areas. So it's showing that cultural, and obviously in the prison, it's even worse, which you write about in here. It was even worse because those are even more marginalized folks who are in captivity. But just seeing how our cultural response to blame or shift blame or be fearful of these things and not tackle them can affect untold number of people, and I don't even know how many people died from it, but it was a lot. Tons of people died from inaction.
You're absolutely. So the book that you're referring to is The Plague Years: A Doctor's Journey Through the AIDS Crisis by Ross Slaton.
Yes.
And it's a memoir. It's one of the many beautiful medical and also sad medical memoirs in which he talks about his experience of AIDS patients in the 1980s and 90s. And you eloquently describe and point out that for a long time, particularly under the Reagan administration, but also thereafter, there was a lot of stigma that was directed towards people who were HIV positive. And on the part of the reticence for the government to act and to provide treatment, definitely killed millions of people. And if not for the activism of people who were involved in groups like ACT UP and who were diligent, because I do not know what it would be like to lose en masse friends, comrades, individuals from the HIV/AIDS and during that early period. But that in itself, I'm sure, led to a lot of trauma in the gay community, and for people who were within the queer spaces and seeing their friends pass away in that capacity. And so I wanted to also provide a slightly hopeful story about, what was happening in the organizing within a prison. But there's so many stories one can tell about HIV/AIDS during that period.
Yes, I love that you knew that it was Dr. Ross Slotkin. I lost the name, but he's actually still practicing, and he's still my mentor's doctor, actually, to this day, which is so awesome. And he's like a local hero in Chicago, where I used to live. But yeah, so this is a good point. I want to, before I get to kind of the conclusion, I feel Ebola is undercovered in the U.S. media. I've talked to people that have no idea what Ebola is, and yet you write about it here in this chapter called Ebola Town. Could you just give us a little, people need to read the book, but can you give us a little bit about what you feel like some of the takeaways on your mind are today about learning about Ebola and how that town was shut down and everything that happened there?
So yeah, Ebola is a disease that was first discovered in the 1970s in sub-Saharan Africa. And since then, it has erupted at various periods in countries such as the Congo, Liberia, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and so forth. In fact, there's an outbreak right now as of March 2025 in Uganda in East Africa, which I just wrote an article about last week in Rolling Stone. Nevertheless, in the book, I focused on one specific period, thinking about the Ebola outbreak in West Africa and Liberia in 2014, when this outbreak basically led to about 28,000 confirmed cases and apparently killed by the end of it 11,000 people. And so one of the aspects of confinement and that I wanted to think about is how a specific neighborhood in Monrovia, Liberia, underwent a lockdown, and a lockdown that many felt was quite draconian, where the population didn't quite know what was going on. The military came in to suppress any form of dissent, but it was also dovetailed with massive scapegoating of West Africans and not always getting the appropriate care that people needed, or even being sensitive to burial practices that people wanted to have at the time of the outbreak. And so I lay out in full details how some of the Liberian doctors were providing care at the time. The Ministry of Culture was adapting to a new situation, and in some cases realized that they had to take another method in order to provide care. But beyond that, this outbreak also was kind of ushered in a new period in which the various African countries realized that they needed a way to coordinate to have some form of surveillance and control around outbreaks. And so the African Center for Disease and Control developed as a result of that outbreak. And hopefully what we can see from that chapter is like, how do we understand the ways in which outbreaks occur on the African continent? How do African scientists and public health departments handle the disease, various diseases that occur? And to what extent do we need to think about building more structural programs that can be led by Africans themselves, so that that diseases are able to be better managed?
Wow, that was very well put. I definitely think people should read that chapter. And Ebola is still a threat. And if it ever really spread, that is the one where I would lock myself in the nearest basement I could find and never come out for months. If you've read about the disease, it is horrific. I think only a few U.S. citizens, it was mostly, unfortunately, a ton of people in the countries you named that died, but a few U.S. citizens had gotten it and had come back over, and they were all like confined in Atlanta and whatnot. And it was just this whole thing, because I don't think people understand the threat of it. And there could be, and this is what we understand, there could be more pandemics and epidemics coming that we aren't even prepared for. And thus the infrastructure, the funding, the research, all of these things are important to collectively prevent something that is preventable from whatever your angle is. I mean, I think in terms of a person who's listening, this stuff it doesn't take much history reading, and you can read it in this book, History of the World in Six Plagues, which there's way more than six. It's just the six that you covered. This stuff comes around every little once in a while. And if it spreads, and if we don't take proper measures, it can devastate the whole world. I mean, obviously Europe is famous for the Black Death and all of that. I can't remember how many people, I don't even know, but it reshaped the entire continent. Yeah, and I think in some ways COVID-19 reshaped a lot of things in the United States, and I wouldn't say all for better. These things are important. It's important to learn about as a person in psychology and philosophy that listen to this podcast. I think the psychological effects are a part of it, but we have to first support scientists and writers who are out there telling the truth and not just their opinion about something. And I think that, unfortunately, in the US culture right now, opinion seems to be weighing as much as fact, at least in terms of media coverage. And that is a very scary place to be as a citizen, because then you have to dig deeper. And I think that is difficult just for anyone, but especially if you don't have had time, access to different scientific papers, things like that, and to understand them from trusted sources. So I know we're basically around the end, but you did mention there's the positives about people coming together. Is there any advice you have for people out there that are scared about, the way the public health response is and how they could maybe personally or collectively come together for health prevention, on the basic scale, but also to prepare for something that could come? Anything you've got for people?
Yeah. So I think that part of the thing that I wanted people to do with not just this book, but other writings that I've done, is to just be curious about science. And what that can mean is just like educating ourselves more about microorganisms on a very basic level, but forming reading groups in which people could discuss science and science studies, reading some of the history of science medical memoirs that I've mentioned, but also just having a bit of grace in terms of how we take in this information. Beyond that, I would highly recommend that people are able to organize with their friends and neighbors, join a union, and support your doctors and nurses and the people who work at hospitals and clinics to know that they have your support as best as they can, and really just try to figure out on the local level, but also structurally, how do we be better to each other. Signing petitions might be the only thing that someone can do, and that's okay. Perhaps even having a pen pal at a prison so that people can understand what is it like for someone who's incarcerated to deal with some of the many things that I talk about in the book. I think that by forming organic connections with individuals and taking a bit more action while also being informed can really help to get rid of the alienation that can be quite rampant right now in the world.
Wow, that's very well put. And that's something we've mentioned a few times on the show, that social media can be fun, but if you experiment with having more conversations with people in your community, and or, like you said, pen pals, getting a little deeper, that can really enhance people's well-being, but also sense of connection, education, and community, which I think as much community as possible is needed in a chaotic realm, which we do seem to be, at least psychologically, currently in a chaotic cycle. So the book is by Simon & Schuster, published it. And this, I will have the links for this in the show notes. And I think if you can pretty much get it from the library as well. And I believe also if your library doesn't have it, just request it. And Barnes & Noble, local bookstores, same kind of thing. I've been in the adjacent to the publishing world. Request it or just buy it online. History of the World in Six Plagues by Dr. Edna Bonhomme. And thank you so much for coming on the show. And I've learned a lot, and I can't wait to finish the whole book because I've been devouring it. So I really appreciate your work, and I'm glad to have you on.
Thank you for having me, and I hope that people can learn and grow from what I've written.
Excellent. I'm sure they will.
And there you have it. This has been another episode of the Intentional Clinician podcast. If you are enjoying the show, please leave us a rating on iTunes or share the show with people you know. I would surely appreciate it. As some of you know, I am passionate about preventing future violence in the United States. I have started a nonprofit with colleagues called the National Violence Prevention Hotline, which is a 501c3 organization. We are endeavoring to gain funding and collaborators and volunteers so that we can start a 24/7 hotline and chat line to reach potential perpetrators before they may act violently. It is a bold effort to curb violence and save innocent lives by working to connect with potential offenders while they are in the planning stages of violence, help to de-escalate them, and provide resources so that they can get appropriate professional help. The National Violence Prevention Hotline is looking to open up a conversation about violence in society, the causes, and the solutions. You can learn more by visiting our website at violencepreventionhotline.org. You can get involved by writing your congressperson from our website, sharing it with your network, or even donating to the cause. If you are looking for an EMDR International Association consultant, I am a consultant and I can help provide 20 hours that you need to become EMDRIA certified. Just check out the show notes and send me a message and see if we're a good fit to work together. If you are in need of counseling, do not hesitate to make an appointment with a local counselor in your area. You can also make an appointment with the excellent clinicians at Health for Life Counseling in Grand Rapids as part of the Trauma Informed Counseling Center of Grand Rapids by visiting www.healthforlifegr.com. And if you are in the state of Michigan, you can also schedule a telehealth appointment. The recording you just listened to consists of the personal opinions of Paul Krauss and his guest, and while these are based upon the literature they have read and the experience in their respective fields, the information on this podcast should not be viewed or thought of as the definitive opinion on any subject. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for treatment. If you're in a crisis, please call 911 or the National Crisis Line at 988. Support your local bookstore by shopping at bookshop.org. That's www.bookshop.org. It donates a percentage of sales to local bookstores all across the United States, which I think gives character to our cities and a place to hang out and a place to explore. You can order from the comfort of your own home online while supporting businesses near you. If you are a therapist and you are not involved in your local counseling or therapist or social work organization, please get involved to at least pay dues so that we can have lobbyists help keep mental health care accessible at the government level, and also expanding into schools and other places that need it. And also, if you didn't know, counseling organizations and professional organizations are working to keep us from becoming gig workers for a lot of large corporations who are coming in and trying to buy up local counseling agencies or basically pay you what they pay for people to deliver food to your house. So, get involved. Until next time on The Intentional Clinician, I wish you all a safe and peaceful week.